Okay, so here we are again. This week we'll be talking about Walter Benjamin, who's a very interesting thinker. Two of his essays, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and something known as the Theses on the Philosophy of History. This very sort of short, fragmentary set of writings that Benjamin wrote shortly before his death, in fact. Now, one quick note before we get to Benjamin himself, or actually related to this, I'm I have to say particularly excited to be talking about this essay today. The work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. First, because it really marks the first time, I guess, in this class we really had a chance to really weigh in and talk about culture and art and the production of culture and art, in a capitalist society, which of course is something that we'll talk about again. But real quick, you may have noticed that one of the readings I put on later in the semester is the graphic novel Mouse, which is also very, relevant to the, topics we'll be covering in class today. But, we're not getting to it until April. So almost 2 months from now. I was wondering if anyone has heard of the recent controversy over this book, with it being, basically banned in certain school districts in the United States, at least one in Tennessee and possibly others. I bring this up now because, things do move on pretty quickly, and by the time we get to it, people have probably moved on to something else. But as of now, this is only, something that's happened within the last, couple of weeks. Has anyone heard anything about that? Or is anyone aware of this? It's kind of an interesting thing to think that, books are still being banned. Though perhaps we shouldn't be entirely surprised either. No? No one's heard anything about it? Well, like I said, basically, it has been banned in at least one school district. Yeah, you've heard of it. Alexandria says. Yeah, kind of an interesting thing. And, we'll cover it in more detail, actually when we turn to it. But if you don't know, I may have mentioned this, the first class already, but, Mouse is a graphic novel written and drawn by Art Spiegelman, which is basically an account of his father's life living as a Jew in occupied Poland, and also as a Holocaust survivor, having been in Auschwitz. So you would think, like, what could possibly be, problematic with that? But apparently, people in this school district in Tennessee felt that the material was objectionable in some ways. They didn't like, I think they specifically mentioned there's a scene of nudity and there's the use of profanity in the book, a book about, the Holocaust, essentially. And that's what they're complaining about. By the way, Mouse, the conceit of Mouse is that it's drawn literally as, cartoon characters. They're cartoon animals. The Jews in the story are, famously depicted as mice. The Nazis are cats, the French are frogs, and so on and so forth. So I'm not even sure what scene of nudity that they're talking about, other than a scene of, naked cartoon mice Jews being herded into a gas chamber. And that's what they're objecting to. And they're objecting apparently to the use of some profanity, cursing, basically, in this story. I mean, it's so stupid. What else can I say? I mean, I can't, articulate it any better than that. But, it's something that we'll come back to. Like I said, I only bring it up now because it is kind of a recent story. And by the time we get to it, it'll be, I'm sure people have moved on to something else. But it is interesting to think that, we'll be covering a book that's basically been, banned in at least some schools throughout America. Anyway, it does, deal, very much relate to what we'll be talking about in the class today, because Walter Benjamin, like most of the Frankfurt School thinkers, was also a Jew. However, unfortunately for him, let me get my slideshow going here. You plug in my laptop too, my charger, I mean. Unfortunately for Benjamin, unlike most of the other Frankfurt School theorists, he, as you can see here, born 1892, died 1940. He did not survive the experience of the war. most of the Frankfurt School theorists had fled Germany, had made it to the United States. Benjamin did not, and actually committed suicide because he was, basically trying to escape from the Nazis. He had, he was a German Jew who had, left Germany to go to France. France, as you may know, in 1940 falls to the Germans, is basically occupied by the Germans throughout the duration of the war. Benjamin was trying to escape across France to Spain, and then from there up, apparently to obtain passage to the United States. He did not make it across. The Spanish authorities did not want to let him cross. He was with a party of other people, completely demoralized by this. He committed suicide. He took I believe an overdose of morphine. Apparently his suicide so alarmed the Spanish authorities, though, that they did actually let the other people cross. So incidentally, his death actually, seems to have saved the lives of the other people in his party. It's a very, tragic story. I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about his personal life, obviously, but it is obviously something that stands out, and it's something that you, of course, obviously have to mention when you're talking about him. But other than that, for the most part, I want to get into the essay itself. So there's a lot to go over, obviously. So let's get on with it. So first, we'll deal with the essay, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which is first written in 1935. Was actually the English translation of this text is actually based on a revised version of the essay, which was published in 1939. So just a year or so before his death, in fact. And it's a very interesting essay in that he has a take on mass culture, which was at this time, of course, in the 1930s, a fairly new thing. You didn't really have much of a mass media at that time. You didn't even have television at the time, but you had radio, you had movies, you had things like that. Obviously, newspapers had been around, but newspapers didn't really have the same sort of mass appeal that these other things did. For the simple reason, of course, that you have to read a newspaper. You don't have to read the radio or read a movie. It's much more accessible in that way. And of course, Benjamin, like many people at this time, is trying to sort of get a handle on these things. And as I've said before, critical theory in many ways is if you want to simplify it, it's sort of a Marxist analysis of mass culture. And up until now, like I said, we've really been sort of dealing with a lot of the groundwork, the foundations of critical theory. This is really in many ways the first real sort of take on this idea, this sort of Marxist approach to mass culture or popular culture, as some people call it. So Benjamin is trying to deal with at least answer two main questions, I would say, right? One, how does the reproduction of works of art, the idea that you can reproduce almost any work of art that has ever existed throughout time, producing multiple copies of it, how does that change the way people look at art, as well as how do new art forms, which sort of which are only possible basically through new forms of technology, like photography and film, right, which he focuses on in particular. How do these things, the reproduction of art and new art forms, basically change consciousness, change our perception of the world and of ourselves? Benjamin takes this question very seriously. The idea that this is essentially producing a new type of consciousness that had previously not existed, prior to this era. And of course, what impact does this have on politics? Very important question as well. Again, Benjamin was somebody who was, very, personally and deeply, affected, as I've already, alluded to, by the rise of fascism, by the rise of Nazism. And he himself is a Marxist, so he has certain, political leanings of his own. All right, so Benjamin very early on in the essay makes reference to the somewhat well-known Marxist idea of the base and superstructure. So anyone that's ever heard of Marx before or Marxist theory before has probably heard of this term or heard of this idea. But if you haven't, basically what it means, it's sort of the relationship between the economy and between other aspects of society. So the base, as it says here, this is of course an illustration I pulled offline, but the base basically refers to two things, right? The economic relations of production, basically the social relationships of owner and employee, of owner and worker, I should say, employer and employee, the kind of social relationships that exist, as well as the means of production, the actual things you need to produce: machines, factories, land, materials, workers, all of which, of course, are owned by the bourgeoisie. So these two things basically make up what is known as the base of society, or literally, as this diagram depicts, the foundation. This is essentially the foundation of the society. It's using obviously a house as kind of a metaphor for society in general. The base then would be basically the foundation of the house. And the house, or the superstructure, makes up essentially everything else: education, family, politics, religion, and mass media. And so the relationship between these two things, as it says here, is that the base shapes the superstructure. So all the things that exist in society as a whole, all the things I just mentioned, education, family, religion, politics, and mass media, are all influenced in some ways by the economic base, by the state or by the level of productivity that exists in society, and by the social relationships of production that exist. In a capitalist society, of course, we're talking about, again, the relationship between worker and owner, basically. So those dynamics, those things that go on in the base, basically shape what goes on in the superstructure. Now, the superstructure, as it says here, maintains and legitimizes the base. So basically, all those things: education, family, etc., religion, etc., what they do is that they create values, they create beliefs that make these economic relations seem natural, basically seem normal and natural, and not something that you should really question. And the kind of interplay between these two things is something that very much concerns a lot of Marxist theorists. Now, the question's always been made, to what extent is the superstructure independent of the base? To what extent can things that go on in the superstructure sort of contradict or sort of oppose or sort of provide a kind of tension with the economic base of society? This is a question which divides a lot of theorists who weigh in on this issue. Some maintain that the superstructure doesn't really have any independence from the base, that the superstructure is mainly there, like I said, to provide a kind of covering, to provide a kind of justification for the economic relations that go on within the base of society. Some would argue that there is some independence, that what goes on in the so-called cultural sphere of society to some extent can criticize economic relations, can somehow be a kind of independent force that goes on from the economic base. So and obviously this then implies a kind of dialectical relationship between these two things, right? So you're looking at two things that seem to be incompatible with each other: economics and culture, basically, and sort of looking at the way these things interact with each other, noting the contradictions that are produced by this, in that sense, to what extent the culture of society really just serves as a way of propping up or legitimizing the sort of economic relations of exploitation that go on in the base of society, as it's called. Now there's also you could look at the interaction between these two things, but you can also look at the contradictions that exist within each of these things. So there's a contradiction that goes on within the base as well, the contradiction between the relations of production and the means of production. So again, Marx famously argues that capitalism, as it develops more, the social relationships that develop between owner and worker eventually becomes an impediment to production. So it actually slows down or sort of slows the growth of of productivity because it creates situations where, you know, a small group of people basically own everything and they become less productive. They don't have to compete as much anymore to produce more, or they get into, you know, non-productive forms of activity like finance, for example, which doesn't really produce anything. So there's a contradiction that exists between the base and superstructure, and there's also contradictions that exist within those things as well. So again, you know, Benjamin just alludes to that very early on in the essay. So I just thought I'd mention that real quickly. All right. And here we go again with the PowerPoint. Oh, let me try something here. All right, lovely. Nowhere where I want it to be. All right, let me try playing it from here. Okay, so, you know, Benjamin makes several references to the French writer Paul Valéry at the beginning of the essay. He also quotes him here, which I think is kind of an interesting thing, as he seemed, you know, and Benjamin makes comments like this as well, including in other things that he wrote. They seem to almost anticipate the internet, or they at least seem to anticipate, you know, sort of wireless communication between people. So I thought that was worth pointing out. So Valéry says, just as water, gas, and electricity are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so we shall be supplied with visual or auditory images, which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign. Interesting to think of, you know, people having this kind of insight back in the 1930s. But of course it is, you know, if you're concerned with communication, then obviously it's something that you should be concerned with, or something that, you know, was possible to, you know, foresee, basically. All right, so this essay is most known for what Benjamin calls, you know, the concept of the aura. And it's this idea that works of art have a certain kind of aura to them, which he explains is basically, you know, it's a subjective thing. It's something that we perceive or something that we kind of impose upon these objects, but it's something that derives from something real, which is the fact that these works of art are, again, prior to the modern era, unique, and that they are, you know, you have to go to a specific place to view these things, that they have their own kind of history to them. He says that basically is what creates the aura of works of art, and that it's the aura basically that is sort of stripped away from works of art in the modern era, what mechanical reproduction makes possible. So as he says on page 220, he says, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element: its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. The unique existence of the work of art determined the history to which it was subject throughout the time of its existence. This includes the changes which it may have suffered in physical condition over the years, as well as the previous changes in its ownership. He goes on to say a couple pages later, we define the aura as the unique phenomenon of a distance, however close it may be. So Benjamin is somewhat, you know, vague, quite frankly, over what he means by this idea of the aura. I think that a lot of that sort of, you know, stems from the fact that it is something basically subjective. It is something that we, you know, a perception that we essentially impose upon the work of art, even though, like I said, it derives from something real, derives from its, as he says, unique existence in time and space, or its unique presence in time and space. He also emphasizes this phenomenon of distance, however close it may be. So what he means by that essentially is that the work of art, even if it's right up close to you, and oftentimes, of course, many times it is not, they are physically removed and distant, but even things that you can see relatively close up, it feels like it's something else. It feels like it's something otherworldly or supernatural almost. And we'll see, of course, when Benjamin talks a little bit about the history of art. Of course, it's impossible to understand art without understanding the role that it played both in magic, in earlier societies, as well as in religion, right? It plays a very sort of important function in these kinds of societies, in so-called, primitive societies where people believe in magic literally, or they, have a more sort of, basic, belief system, as well as in the so-called, monotheistic religions which develop later. Or, you can't really understand art without understanding the relationship of art to those things. And of course, art in that sense, it does create a sense, like I said, of something otherworldly, something, outside the normal realm of things. All right, so he also speaks of it a little bit more in the following passage. And sort of elaborates a little bit more on what he says. So this is actually on page 221. Sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit as well. But he says, one might subsume the eliminated element in the term aura and go on to say that which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of the work of art. This is a symptomatic process whose significance points beyond the realm of art. One might generalize by saying the technique of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition. Again, tradition being a very sort of important concept here as well. By making many reproductions, it substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique existence. And in permitting the reproduction to meet the beholder or listener in his own particular situation, it reactivates the object reproduced. These two processes lead to a tremendous shattering of tradition, which is the obverse of the contemporary crisis and renewal of mankind. So again, I'm not sure what people's take on these things are when they're reading it. Please, feel free to share your interpretations of things in the chat or otherwise. But I think what he's saying here, and what I think sort of makes Benjamin different from a lot of other so-called cultural critics or cultural theorists, is that, most critics take a very sort of, pessimistic view of contemporary culture, no matter what era they're living in. Critics of the 1930s look very, pessimistically towards the culture of the 1930s. Critics today look very, pessimistically towards the culture of today as well. But Benjamin seems to have a much more kind of nuanced take. He seems much more sort of ambivalent, I would say. Ambivalent meaning sort of like mixed emotions. He's not wholeheartedly championing modern day culture, but I think he realizes that there are certain positive aspects to this as well. So most people will, usually when they talk about, the decline of tradition and things like that, they usually mean it in a negative way. Benjamin seems to regard this as a positive development. He thinks that it's actually kind of a good thing. In other words, that art is being sort of breaking free of its dependence on traditional values. And of course, I think the obvious reason for that is because Benjamin sees traditional values as being a support for, oppressive institutions, political institutions, economic institutions, social institutions, like, certain concepts of family, certain, ideas of family life, and certain, social norms and values and things like that. So he takes a much more kind of, like I said, sort of ambivalent take on these things to this idea of the decline of the aura of the work of art. And again, the decline of this aura is made possible by the phenomenon of mechanical reproduction. The idea that you can now look at copies of almost any work of art imaginable. Take the Mona Lisa, for example, right? Probably the most famous painting in the world. Up until, basically around the 20th century, if you want to see the Mona Lisa, you had to go to where it actually was. There was one in the entire world. And if you want to see it, you had to go where it was. Or take the Sistine Chapel for, another example, maybe something even harder to reproduce. Nowadays, there are, literally, endless copies, limitless copies of the Mona Lisa. Anyone can view the Mona Lisa whenever they want. Even the Sistine Chapel, although you can't physically recreate the exact physical space, you can at least reproduce the famous images that adorn the chapel, right? The ceilings and wall of the chapel. And what he's saying is that basically what happens is when you're able to do that is that basically the aura that these things had prior to this goes away. But again, and I'm getting maybe a little bit ahead of myself here. He views this as mostly a good thing. So a little bit more on this idea of the loss of tradition. He says both processes, which again, what I believe he's referring to is the plurality of things, the idea that art is no longer unique, or that works of art are no longer unique, and the nearness of things, the idea that you can now, look at great works of art, literally sitting in your pajamas in your house without having to actually go anywhere. Both these things are intimately connected with the contemporary mass movements. And here, of course, he's referring to mostly fascism and communism. Their most powerful agent is the film. Its social significance, particularly in its most positive form, is inconceivable without its destructive cathartic aspect. That is the liquidation of the traditional value of the cultural heritage. So again, liquidation means that it's essentially like melting down. These sort of rigid and very static traditions which have existed for centuries, and maybe in some cases millennia, are now being liquefied. They're completely sort of breaking down, he's saying. And again, this leads to a change in perception. So as he says, also on page 222, he says, during long periods of history, the mode of human sense perception changes with humanity's entire mode of existence. The manner in which human sense perception is organized, excuse me one second. The manner in which human sense perception is organized, the medium in which it is accomplished, is determined not only by nature, but by historical circumstances as well. Again, he goes on to say, to pry an object from its shell, to destroy its aura, is the mark of a perception whose sense of the universal equality of things has increased to such a degree that it extracts it even from a unique object by means of reproduction. Thus is manifested in the field of perception what in the theoretical sphere is noticeable in the increasing importance of statistics. The adjustment of reality to the masses and of the masses to reality is a process of unlimited scope, as much for thinking as for perception. So again, he's saying that there's a historical basis to perception. So if you think back to what we were talking about last week with Kant, which it informs a lot the Horkheimer essay. Kant, believed the perception was more or less a fixed thing, right? He tried to, delineate or to explain, the categories of the mind which make perception possible. And it's a very sort of elaborate structure, but he does also believe that that structure is more or less a permanent and unchanging thing. Benjamin is rejecting this idea, as did Horkheimer as well, which is that no, perception is not always the same. And obviously, of course, individual people are going to have different perceptions of things, but they're talking about in more of a historical sense that people as a whole sort of evolve different ways of perceiving objects. From a religious way, let's say, of looking at the world to a more secular, science-based way, even though not everyone, has, advanced scientific knowledge, right? Most people don't sort of look at the world in the sort of religious, interpretation of things, for example, that the people had prior to that. But Benjamin sort of elaborates on that as well. Anyway, like he says, going back to this idea of the aura, that, people's perception of things is basically changed. That we no longer look at these works of art as something that's unique and special, which again could be bad in some ways. But he's also saying that it's ultimately a good thing because it is in a sense sort of like freeing ourselves from sort of attaching a kind of false, illusion to these things, particularly the role that they play in traditional societies, the way in which they play a role in sort of, propping up or sustaining these types of traditional societies. So he goes on, actually, a quote from much later on in the essay, but I brought it here because he seems to really sort of elaborate on this idea more. He's talking here about, the impact in which, the camera, both the photographic camera as well as the, the motion picture camera, the way in which that changes perception. And again, I mean, many people might be aware of these things that they exist, but Benjamin really takes this idea very seriously. And for him, this is actually creating literally a revolutionary change in consciousness. It is literally, permanently changing the way people think. It is essentially, rewiring the way our brains work in a way in which people like Kant and people from his era and, before then, who obviously, didn't have these things available back then, could never have really sort of foreseen or anticipated. So he says, with the close-up, in other words, when a camera, sort of, enlarges an object by focusing in on it, space expands. With slow motion, movement is extended. The enlargement of a snapshot does not simply render more precise what in any case was visible, though unclear. It reveals entirely new structural formations of the subject. So too, slow motion not only presents familiar qualities of movement, but reveals in them entirely unknown ones, which, far from looking like retarded, rapid movements, give the effect of singularly gliding, floating, supernatural motions. Evidently, a different nature opens itself to the camera than opens to the naked eye, if only because an unconsciously penetrated space is substituted for a space consciously explored by man. Even if one has a general knowledge of the way people walk, one knows nothing of a person's posture during the fractional second of a stride. The act of reaching for a lighter or a spoon is familiar routine. Yet we hardly know what really goes on between hand and metal, not to mention how this fluctuates with our moods. Here, the camera intervenes with the resources of its lowerings and liftings, its interruptions and isolations, its extensions and accelerations, its enlargements and reductions. The camera introduces us to the unconscious optics, as does psychoanalysis to unconscious impulses. And that's an interesting comparison too, to compare the camera basically to psychoanalysis. So I think it's a very interesting statement, and again, and maybe something that many people take for granted nowadays. Maybe, maybe not, but we have all obviously grown up with these things. They've been a part of our lives, since we were born, literally. And as I've said before, I think one of the reasons why these, this generation of thinkers are very interesting, being born around the 1880s, 1890s, is that all these people were basically old enough to remember what life was like before you had these things, before, not to say that they didn't exist at all. Obviously, photography and things like that, had existed since, basically the middle of the 19th century. But you didn't really have motion pictures, maybe in its very earliest infancy, but, we're certainly a long way off from sound films, not to mention color films, as well as other, cinematic and photographic techniques that have been invented since then. So I think it's really interesting to really, consider how these things change the way people perceive the world. The fact that, prior to this, you couldn't really, analyze a person's face that closely, and sort of, note the various sort of subtle movements of a person's face, particularly when they're, speaking or emoting or expressing different emotions. The idea that you can sort of slow things down and sort of really analyze how a person moves, how a person walks in slow motion. All those things, again, should not be taken for granted, that they really actually, almost like permanently change the way people's brains function, basically. I mean, that's essentially what he's saying here. All right. So he mentions this. He mentions or he mentions a statue of Venus. I'm assuming he's referring to this one, the famous Venus de Milo, and how changes in perception of this object have changed. So this is a statue that goes back to it's classical antiquity. And Benjamin mentions that for the the Greeks and the Romans, I think for the Romans actually, that this would have been an object of religious worship, right? This would have been something that they would express, not just see it as a symbolic representation, but almost see it as the presence of the god itself. In this case, the god, or the goddess Venus. Whereas in another era of time, the perception of this object completely changes, right? And then you're talking about medieval Christianity and how they see it as some sort of sinister, almost pagan icon. So it's one example of how the object itself can change. And then of course you could also add to that modern day sensibilities, which only sees it as a piece of sculpture, neither an object of worship nor nothing to be nor seeing as anything sinister or anything like that, but simply as a statue basically. So it's interesting to think like how the object itself can be the same, but people can sort of bring radically different interpretations or perceptions of this object. Here's something else. So I thought this was interesting. So Benjamin refers to examples. He refers to certain paintings of the Madonna, of the Holy Mother, of Mary, basically, of Christian theology, that are covered up almost all year round, not displayed to the public unless under certain special occasions, or certain statues in cathedrals that are not visible to the spectator from the ground level. You actually have to go up to the top basically to be able to see these things. Here's an example of something in a similar vein. This is known as the Ghent Altarpiece, which is in the cathedral in the city of Ghent in Belgium. It's also known as the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, which I think is kind of a funny title. But this is an altarpiece. So this would be something that, well, let me go ahead. So this was something that you could only see on certain times of the year. It opens up essentially. So this is how it looks when it's closed, right? These sort of like wooden doors or flaps made of wood basically cover it. And then it would be, if you look back to it, you can then sort of almost see, hopefully, what it would look like when those doors are sort of opened up and the image that's sort of displayed within. Again, most of the time this would be closed. You would only see it like this. It would only be opened up during special like holy days basically, or feast days in the Catholic religion. And again, if you think of that in context to the era now, where we can look at any piece of art, including obviously this, that we can look at it at a moment's whim basically, or with very little effort. What Benjamin's saying is that it kind of, it does of course kind of take away the specialness of these things, right? That to people living back then, to be able to see this thing, and again, only being able to see it under certain circumstances, basically, only on special days, basically, it sort of, gave it a special sense of importance. It made it feel special, basically, for lack of a better term. And that sense of specialness, which again is, I think closely associated with this, this concept of the aura, is sort of taken away once you're able to reproduce this image basically whenever you please. And of course, it's even more, it's easier even now to do these things than it was during Benjamin's day. And of course, that's also, again, very much connected with a very tight, special kind of perception of these things. So what Benjamin is talking about here is that when people would see things like this, and I've also heard of stories of, certain paintings or statues would be taken out of the church or the cathedral and would sort of like toured around, right? We're going back obviously to like the Middle Ages here. It would be toured around to neighboring towns and villages and things like that. And people would come around and see these things. When they saw something like this, or when they saw something like this altarpiece here, to them, it was not a symbol. It was not just a representation. It was literally the presence of the divine. They were literally seeing God himself, or at least a manifestation of God. And, again, without going into the obvious complexities of Catholic theology and stuff, if you've ever noted the idea, the so-called, idea of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, it's the last one that people pay the least amount of attention to. But what do they mean by the Holy Spirit? It is sort of God's presence, sort of, manifesting through human efforts. But again, according to the theology, it's on the same level, right? It is part of the Holy Trinity. It is on the same level as the Father and the Son and all that other stuff. And please don't ask me to explain Catholic theology any more than that. But again, if you take that idea seriously, as people did back then when you're seeing this is the Holy Spirit. This is the manifestation of the Holy Spirit. This is God himself, and I guess that would be accurate for the time back then to use that gendered language. This is God himself appearing before you. And so you could only try to imagine the kind of enthusiasm that people would have for these kinds of things. And again, Benjamin mostly celebrates the decline of this way of thinking, and I think for very good reason. But it is, you could almost step back for a second and think like it's almost envious, how people would get so excited for things like that, and the kind of lack of interest or sort of lack of excitement, I guess you could say, that people have for modern day art. For them, it's just a symbol. You might appreciate this. You can still obviously look at this thing now and appreciate the artistry of it. You can appreciate the craft that goes into it and all that other stuff, but nobody's actually going to think that it's the literal presence of God, before you. And so that does sort of lead to a sort of a lack of passion, a lowering of energy and enthusiasm, which people have towards modern day art. That's where I think that Benjamin has some ambivalence over this. But ultimately, I think he says that, it's basically a good thing that people don't, take this stuff all that seriously anymore. So that's one example of it. And again, the kind of ritualistic nature of it sort of adds to that as well. The idea, again, that you can only see this only on their certain days sort of, emphasizes that fact as well. So again, when Benjamin talks about the value of art or the changing values of art, that's basically what he's saying. So that originally, as he says, art has what he calls a kind of cult value to it. The value of the art comes from the sort of function that it serves in religious cults. And obviously cult has a very sort of negative connotation to it, which I think is very much intended by Benjamin. But that's basically what he's saying. It's a sort of a piece of propaganda, essentially, to sort of prop up various religious cults, he says. Or as he says here, originally the contextual integration of art in tradition found its expression in the cult. We know that the earliest artworks originated in the service of a ritual. First, the magical, and for that, I don't have the quote here, but even references, cave paintings and things like that. So first the magical, then the religious kind. It is significant that the existence of the work of art with reference to its aura is never entirely separated from its ritual function. In other words, the unique value of the authentic work of art has its basis in ritual, the location of its original use value obviously being a Marxist concept, right? The utility, the unique quality that an object has is its use value. So the unique quality that a work of art has is that it is of service of this kind of ritualistic thinking and sort of supporting these rituals, which in turn support traditional values, basically. This ritualistic basis, however remote, is still recognizable as secularized ritual, even in the most profane forms of the cult of beauty. And this is another sort of important theme that Benjamin has here. Benjamin's very much against this idea of what people often call art for art's sake, or the idea that people, and I think this is still true in a modern day sense, that people almost, people who are not religious at all in the traditional sense almost now deify art, right? They make art into almost a divine thing. They almost worship art, and they worship almost great works of art, and they sort of elevate the artists who produce art or create art into these, almost like superhuman figures. And they elevate it, and they attach all this importance to it. I would say that's still, like I said, very much a prevalent view, at least in some sectors of society today. Benjamin seems very much critical of this view. And again, as he says in the very next quote, with the advent of the first truly revolutionary means of reproduction, photography, simultaneously with the rise of socialism, art sensed the approaching crisis, which has become evident a century later. At the time, art reacted with the doctrine of l'art pour l'art, or basically art for art's sake. That is, with a theology of art. So again, explicitly calling it a theology, meaning basically like a religion of art. This gave rise to what might be called a negative theology in the form of the idea of pure art, which not only denied any social function of an art, but also any categorizing by subject matter. I think this is a typo there. But again, this idea of art for art's sake is that, artists, they're almost like above things. They're like above society. They're above the fray, so to speak. They're above the petty squabbles of classes, and they're just existing in this pure space of creating art. I mean, I don't know if you've personally experienced examples of people that talk or act that way, but I certainly have. And like I said, I think this is very, very much still something that's with people now. So when he calls it a negative theology, he's basically saying, it's like a theology without God. It's not a literal theology in that you're expressing a belief in a divine being or something like that, but you're almost worshiping art. You're almost elevating art to the level of a religion, basically. And like I said, almost, to the point of worship. Which he finds to be very much a false, view of things. And again, if you had any doubt that Benjamin doesn't regard the decline of the aura as a good thing, I think the following quote really spells that out. He says on page 224, for the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. So he's saying that the art couldn't really exist on its own, that it's now free from its service to religious rituals, basically. And of course, to the service of a society which uses religion to support a certain kind of social structure. I mean, is there even a single example of a society, of a large scale society throughout history which did not use religion to justify, political authority, whether it's the divine right of kings, the idea of a caliphate, the mandate of heaven, and various other things like that? I mean, almost all religions that I'm aware of, at least any sort of, large scale civilization has always used religion as a means of propping up, political authority and as a means of supporting a certain type of social structure. Anyway, so he says, but the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics. So art is becoming political in the modern day era, very self-consciously political, you might say. So with the change in art, with the change in the perception of art, the cult value of art, he says, tends to go away, at least a little bit. And what the new function of art becomes is what he calls exhibition value. So he says, with the different methods of technical reproduction of a work of art, its fitness for exhibition increased to such an extent that the quantitative shift between its two poles turned into a qualitative transformation of its nature. So here again, this contrast between quantity and quality, which we've talked about before. This is comparable to the situation of the work of art in prehistoric times, when by the absolute emphasis on its cult value, it was first and foremost an instrument of magic. Only later did it come to be recognized as a work of art. In the same way today, by the absolute emphasis on its exhibition value, the work of art becoming a creation with entirely new functions, among which the one we are conscious of, the artistic function, later may be recognized as incidental. This much is certain. Today, photography and film are the most serviceable exemplifications of this new function, this function being, again, the exhibition value. So if the previous value of art was that it's assisted in cults, basically, it played this sort of ritualistic function. What is the modern day value of art? It's what he calls exhibition value. But what does he mean by exhibition value? What does it mean to exhibit something? What he's saying basically is that it's the value of art is now what it can show to people, right? It becomes a means of communication essentially between people. It's less about propping up a specific type of social structure or a specific type of religious structure than it is about sort of bringing to light certain things, showing people things that they didn't already know about. I think he has some interesting examples of that. So one person that he focuses on who displays this tendency is the photographer Eugene Atget, or Atget, who was a French photographer around this period of time. And of course, here are some examples of his photography, the next few slides as well. Benjamin has a very sort of insightful comment here, where right, he says that Atget's photographs are like, scenes of a crime. And I think this might be one example of that, which kind of, speaks to that idea. And again, he's saying that, it is showing you something. The value of this art is what it shows you, what it's able to communicate about the world around you. So Atget took a lot of photographs like this. And there's a definite kind of quality, there's a definite kind of mood that this evokes. Obviously the difficulty with dealing with any piece of art is that there's always some subjective element. So what I'm seeing and perceiving about it, may not be the same as what you see. I'd be very, curious to how people take this. But there's a kind of, strange quality about it, which stems from this scene of what looks like a garage or something like that. And you see evidence of humanity, basically, or evidence of human, products, at least, without actual seeing any people themselves. It's almost like it has like almost a ghost-like quality to it, like the people in the scene have vanished or something like that. And again, he compares it to a crime scene, which I think is a very insightful commentary. Now, before I forget, I also want to make reference to the Japanese director Ozu, who his films have a similar kind of quality to them, in that he has a very distinct style of movie making. But one of the things that stands out most about the way he makes movies is that he would also have a lot of scenes in his movies like this, where you would sort of see this, human space, but without any people in it. It's not a natural space. It's not just he's showing nature, though maybe sometimes he would do things like that. But more often than not, it would show the interiors of houses. It would show something like this, a street scene or something like that. And you see sort of the evidence of humanity without actually seeing any people themselves. And it has a strange, quality to it, or at least for me, at least, it evokes a kind of, vaguely sort of unsettling feeling. Which I guess only comes from sort of seeing human spaces without actually seeing people, almost like something is missing from that. Vaguely, it's not like an overwhelming feeling of terror or anything like that, but there's something I would say at least sort of vaguely unsettling about seeing these kinds of spaces without seeing any actual people in them. There's some interesting quality that comes from that. Here are a couple of other examples. So this obviously is a picture of a woman, but the street scene itself looks very, sparse, run down, probably, one of the working class areas of Paris. Yeah, Kayam, you ever hand up?
I was going to ask, what year are these paintings from?
These would be roughly 1920s or so, maybe a little bit earlier.
Okay.
roughly from that period of time. Turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. Here's another picture. Has a, again, a very kind of, if I were to describe these, photographs in one word, I would say spooky, right? There's kind of a spooky quality, like I said, or almost like a ghost-like quality to these images. Now, for Benjamin and for people like that, this would have been, contemporary society at the time. But from our, but I think the coloring of the photography and things like that would have been evident to people back then. But I think especially when we look at it now, I feel almost like looking at these pictures, like it's almost like looking at some kind of like a ghost world. Like we're looking at some sort of, foreign land, basically. We're looking at something that's sort of outside of the normal social world that we all inhabit. But of course, this is society. This is, Paris at a certain point, roughly around the turn of the 20th century. But it does, I think, very much evoke a specific kind of mood or feeling with very, like minimal effort. I mean, there's very, there's not much going on here. You don't see much action going on here, but it's just in the pure presentation itself that it does so. Yeah, Chaim, did you have your hand up again?
It kind of reminds me of like, if you took a picture of like a rundown mall plaza, but a filter on it, it's like the remnants of capitalism or a product of capitalism.
Right. Yeah.
There's definitely it's just it's like so modern, but it's like an artificial. It's totally artificial.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's kind of like the contrast of these things. It's as you said, very, very modern, but there's also this element of decay at the same time. Things are kind of falling apart. I mean, these are kind of older buildings, obviously, but this is, would have been, a modern day street scene, basically. But there's this sort of element of, things sort of, falling apart at the same time. The last image, I think, is actually the creepiest, if I can switch over. Building anticipation, I guess. Does anyone else have any, takes on this? I mean, what like I said, all this is subjective to a certain extent. Does anyone else have any impressions of this? Speaking of Impressionism, which we'll be talking about it in a moment. All right, just bear with me here. All right, so this image, I think, is by far, the creepiest looking, and all it is essentially are mannequins in a storefront window. But again, this kind of like ghost-like quality seems to pervade, the whole atmosphere of this photograph. How the mannequins almost seem to be sort of almost like fading out of existence. Obviously, the effect is simply just captured by photographing them through the store window, but it kind of creates that effect nonetheless. The kind of frozen, rigid expressions on their faces, very much. Obviously, these are actual mannequins, but of course that criticism is often made of kind of bourgeois society and stuff that kind of imposes this sort of unnatural, rigid kind of behavior upon people. Yeah, very much like something like the Twilight Zone. It's probably why that show has been such a perennially popular show. And even I think, I don't know to what extent this is intentional or not, but you also see the reflection of like these older buildings also to some extent in the mirror, which also seem as if they're kind of fading away. So I think, again, it'd be interesting to hear other people's take on it. I'm not that well versed in art, by the way, so I'm just sort of going based on my own sort of off the cuff impressions of these things. But what I get out of it is it seems to be almost like a statement, right, of sort of, again, one society kind of fading out of existence, an older, more traditional society fading out of existence, while a sort of new modern society, exemplified here by consumerism. Of course, what better example of consumerism can you have than a storefront window with clothing and mannequins and things like that as us kind of fading into existence. But they're all also at the same time kind of juxtaposed with each other, right? They're both sort of coexisting at the same time, but one's sort of fading out of existence and one's sort of, fading into existence or coming into existence. Am I crazy? Does anyone else have any takes on it like that? I mean, or just any impression of it at all? I mean, am I wrong to say that it's kind of a creepy image? I mean, it certainly seems kind of creepy to me. Very, like I said, very, ghost-like, very kind of spooky. Yeah, very, very much like something like the Twilight Zone. No, all right. So, the next thing I want to focus on is, talk a little bit more about the relationship between photography and painting, since of course this is something that Benjamin talks about. So, and again, also, refers to changes in perceptions that people have had. So, Benjamin argues that, again, with the development of photography, it basically changes the whole sort of approach to painting, which had existed for centuries. I mean, we're talking literally 500 years or more prior to this. And I think that's true because once you can photograph something and make a more or less, exact reproduction of things, then what's the point of painting that way? In other words, and this is an example here, the painting is entitled Paulus Verso, which I forgot to look up exactly what that means, but I believe it has something to do with the, the view from, like the balcony or something like that, by the painter John Leon Jerome. I believe that's how you say his name. And this is an example of what would have been considered sort of the established style or the established aesthetic of painting at this period of time, and which again had more or less existed for hundreds of years prior to this, which is that the goal or the objective which the painter is aiming for here is to depict reality as accurately as you possibly can, right? To make it look realistic, in other words. Which is, if that is your goal, I mean, this painting does a fairly good job of that. Painters back then strove to, minimize the presence of the artist, right? You didn't even want to think about the artist when you were looking at this thing. The painter would go through great effort to make their brush strokes. Of course, this is painted with a paintbrush, to make their brush strokes invisible so that you couldn't even notice it. And again, the strove above all else to provide a kind of realistic depiction of reality. And thematically, I mean, this is obviously a scene taken from antiquity. These were kind of, the main themes that you would see in most paintings. Most paintings, basically stretching from the Renaissance, essentially up until the late 19th century, were scenes taken from antiquity, including many scenes, depicting Greek and Roman mythology. They would be scenes of great historical events and supposedly great historical leaders like Napoleon or, whoever, Alexander the Great, maybe. Can't think of any paintings with him, but things like that. Definitely, there are famous paintings of Napoleon and people like that, and scenes of great, historical events and kings and generals and all that other stuff. And then obviously, biblical stuff, religious imagery. Those three themes pretty much made up the major, concerns or the major themes of most painters, again, from the Renaissance basically up until the modern day. Antiquity, great historical events, and religion. Christianity, in other words. But all that basically begins to change with the invention of photography, which means not only did painters not strive as much to be as realistic as possible, but also there was more of a concern. And I think part of this is due to, again, as Benjamin says, with the rise of socialism, which also sort of, comes with the, develops at the same time as the invention of photography and things like that, with more of a concern with real life, the mundane aspects of life, if you will. And this starts to take shape in the Impressionist movement. So what you see here, and which I'll try to sketch out, let's see if I can even get through all of it in the 15 minutes or so we have left. But I'll try to briefly sort of sketch out, the history of painting from Impressionism basically up until Benjamin's time, not necessarily modern day. And what you'll see, I think one of the driving themes, which hopefully should become very obvious, is that starting from this point of view where, again, painters try to do everything as realistic as possible, you see a greater and greater move towards more abstraction in painting, right? It becomes less about depicting real life events or so-called real life events, and more about sort of expressing, sort of an inner state of being through color, basically, through form and through color. And it's interesting to point out that the early Impressionists, and this is Monet's painting, and this is really where the Impressionist movement gets its name from. This is known as Impressions or Impression Sunrises, which I believe was painted in the same year or completed in the same year as this painting. Drastically different, approach to style. And this was the kind of stuff that was established, right? I mean, so the Impressionists, as they were known as, I wrote this down here because I always forget this name. They were I'm even going to try to say it in French, but they were the Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. This is the name that Monet and a handful of other people, Pierre Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, and a few other people, this is the name that they sort of took for themselves. And they essentially created their own kind of underground movement. I mean, this is sort of like, punk rock of the late 1800s. They were shunned by the artistic establishment of their day, which favored this. So there was something known as the Paris Salon, where they would sort of exhibit all the great works by painters of this era. And this is the kind of stuff that these, sort of cultural critics, the sort of cultural elite, this is what they liked. They did not like the Impressionists. They were rejected time and time again, to the point where they basically said, all right, you know what, the hell with it. We're going to form our own little group. We're going to have our own exhibitions. We're not going to try to appease these people anymore. And it's interesting to say because, nowadays Impressionism is hardly seen as a radical movement, which it was kind of seen as back then. It's not really seen as an edgy movement. Many times it's dismissed by people as being decorative art. It's very nice looking. There's a very kind of, pleasant quality to a lot of it. And that may be true, but I mean, at least at the time, it was all those things. It was kind of considered edgy. It was kind of considered radical. And it was rejected again by the cultural elites. And I like to harp on that point because you see that happen so often, especially from this period of time of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And now too, of course, where these sort of self-appointed cultural elites, the people who determine what's good art and what's not, what's beauty and what's not, and things like that, they so often get things wrong, right? And they're so conservative and they're so rigid and are adverse to any sort of new innovation or anything like that. And time again, what you see happens is that these people keep striving, and eventually, their views do sort of break through, and are, of course, no one today would say that Monet isn't a brilliant painter or whatever. And what happens is that they keep doing their thing basically, and they do win greater and greater approval and acclaim. And then the same kind of elites who one time turned down their noses at these people now then sort of co-opt these things. And it's just a funny thing to point out because you see it happen so many times, especially with painting, especially with literature. Think of all the great writers who were not appreciated in their own lifetime: Kafka, Dostoevsky, Herman Melville, and so many others, obviously. Only to, at a much later period of time, now be proclaimed geniuses and brilliant and all this other stuff by essentially the same kind of people who were originally, rejecting these people. And it does kind of make you think, what are our so-called cultural elites? What are they sort of turning their noses down to? Is that the right expression? What are they, turned off by, or what are they, objecting to? That probably 20, 30 years from now, people will probably say is brilliant as well. Yeah, Kyan, you have your hand up again?
Yeah, I was gonna say this when we were talking about Benjamin's work and like why people buy art, and probably people in the chat, or I mean in the class, thought about Banksy. I'm not sure if you know about Banksy.
Yeah, sure.
And he had this one exhibition where the person bought the art, and then like once they bought it, it actually had like a self-destruction mechanism where it ripped into shreds, and like the art became even more valuable
Oh,
just
really?
because it got ripped. But like yeah, it's just another example of like the bourgeois taking like ideas critical of society and just like pacifying it essentially.
Yeah, co-opting it. Yeah, I mean, it's a current theme, and you see it happen, like I said, time and time again. Sometimes by the same people, sometimes by it's, you know, sort of like the next generation of, you know, bourgeois critics and stuff, but sometimes it's even the same people who once, you know, yeah, and Banksy, who kind of got his career, I guess, what people sometimes call street art, which is, you know, a term like any other, I guess. But yeah, how many people, you know, used to dismiss graffiti art and things like that, and now they look, oh wow, these people are brilliant and stuff like that. You know, it's the same thing, and now we kind of are at that point where now so-called street art is appropriated by these bourgeois critics and stuff. But it does kind of make you wonder, so what else is out there that hasn't been co-opted yet? Maybe there's not that much. I mean, maybe culture has declined a lot. I mean people are, you know, yeah, I mean, for these movements to develop, you have to have some people out there who are at least not, you know, saddled with a job, that they have some time to create art. I mean, you really wonder, like, how, you know, where are the people that even have the time to do this anymore, other than basically, you know, the sons and daughters of the bourgeoisie, who now, you know, not only do they want to appropriate the art, but now they also think that they're the creators of art, even though it's actually very much not the historical trend at all. Most of the great art sort of comes, you know, for the most part, either outside the bourgeoisie, or by people who were very much on the margins of the bourgeoisie themselves. But anyway, so let me move on a little bit. So I haven't even really begun to, you know, sort of sketch this out, but just a few sort of examples to really show you the sort of greater push towards more and more abstract art, the move away from realism to more abstract art, which again, Benjamin is arguing here, and I think it's quite true, is obviously in large part driven by the invention of photography. I mean, what else could it possibly be? You know, how else would you explain the fact that for roughly 500 years or so, painters all basically strove for the same thing, and then in roughly 50 years, from the 1870s to the 1920s, you see this enormous change in painting towards almost total abstraction, which had never really happened before, at least in, you know, painting. I mean, people do have pointed that out, that abstract art has always existed, but didn't always exist in painting. So let me try to make my way through this. So here's another example of an impressionist painter, Edgar Degas, who I have to say is probably my favorite of the impressionist painters. Now, Degas was somebody who kind of rejected the impressionist label. He did not like to think of himself as an impressionist, and he really thought of himself as more in the sort of classical school of painters. Oh, by the way, I forgot to point out too that this painting by Jerome, if I'm saying that correctly, I never really heard of him before, but I want to find an example of what, you know, would have been considered the establishment at that time. It's, you know, it's a nice painting for what it is, I guess. This style of painting is also known as academicism or something like that, which I think is kind of funny because, you know, when you hear the term academic, it usually has kind of a negative connotation to it, right? It usually means something kind of stuffy and stifled and repressed, and you know, generally, you know, the term academic, I'm speaking here as an academic, doesn't always have the best connotation to it. But I think that's a fairly accurate way. It's very technical, it's very academic in the sense that it's based upon sort of the you know, prevailing standards of knowledge, but it's also very, you know, conservative. And you know, with a little bit of foreshadowing here as my PowerPoint freezes up again, to skip ahead a little bit, you know, when you get to the Nazis, who of course are extremely critical of all forms of modern art. If you understand, the modern art more or less begins with Impressionism and through the various movements that take place after that, the Nazis hated all of that stuff. In fact, they labeled it degenerate art, which I'll try to talk a little bit about, probably not not this class. But when you look at, well, what is the kind of art that they like then? Well, it's basically stuff like this. I mean, the sort of neoclassical approach, if that's the right term, but this sort of, they like these sort of scenes of, Greek and Roman antiquity. And of course, like, big, macho men doing macho things like, killing people in the Colosseum and stuff like that, and emphasizing, physicality and, physical beauty and stuff like that. That is the stuff that the Nazis liked. And I think that it, is kind of interesting to consider in light of recent events or sort of recent cultural standards, to what extent, people, sort of fetishize the Greeks and the Romans, the movie Gladiator, which came out, it's kind of an old movie now, but, and stuff like that, to the extent in which people kind of fetishize that kind of lifestyle, or sort of fetishize this sort of, ancient period of life. All right, well, I guess I'll have to stop this now. The PowerPoint is not cooperating. We only have 3 minutes left. I'd like to just mention real quickly, if I can switch back over to the Canvas for a second, the time we have left. So I mentioned before that I have reopened some of the past assignments. Does anything work? Now I can't switch over to the discussion section on Canvas. So if you haven't done them, I believe there's probably 3 or 4 people that haven't done some of the assignments. Lukash, Marks, and Horkheimer now. Please do so. I mean, normally I close these things after the end of the week, so you can't access it. I did open it up again. One student reached out to me, said that she was, sick for a couple of weeks and didn't have a chance to do them. She has completed them, but there are a couple of other people who haven't. If you haven't, please do so. I'll leave it open for a couple more days, maybe up until Thursday, but after that, I'll be closed. Again, the directions for it are in the assignment itself. So please do that if you have not done so already. Any questions about anything else, please let me know. Otherwise, if there's nothing else, then I guess I can let you go now. Okay. All right. So take care, everyone. I'll see you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.